Today we start talking about the last major figure for the first part of the course. The first part of the course ending by the time we get into the 1920s and after World War II, when logical positivism is going to begin to arise in Vienna and Berlin and some other places like that. In any case, Wittgenstein is both the last figure in the logical atomism period of the history of analytic philosophy, and also a bridge to logical positivism, because the Tractatus formed a kind of intellectual Bible for the early Vienna circle. They viewed it as trying to articulate what they were after, which we will see and talk about later. In any case, let's talk about early Wittgenstein first. Later Wittgenstein, by the way, arises in the 1930s. Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus, thought he had solved all the problems of philosophy, and so returned to Austria from Cambridge, started teaching elementary school, second grade, in a small town in Austria. I think he taught at a couple of different places in Austria, but he was done with philosophy. He didn't think there was anything left to be said or done. By the late 1920s, he had begun to change his mind, and so returned to Cambridge. There's a transition period before the ideas that get encoded in the investigations started appearing. But in any case, he didn't completely abandon philosophy forever, though that was his intention. Wittgenstein is one of the strangest figures in the history of analytic philosophy. So let's look at some of the important figures and some revealing quotes. He was suicidal. He never committed suicide, but he was suicidal much of his life. And when you learn something about his family life, especially the behavior of his father, it's not hard to see how somebody like this could be suicidal. In fact, he had a brother who committed suicide, and he also had another brother that was killed in World War I, and there's some concern that it might have been an act of suicide as well. In any case, this is a picture of Wittgenstein. The eyes are really incredible in this picture. So first, the dates, some dates that are relevant. Remember, Frege's life begins in 1848. He dies in 1925. As you recall, the central important dates for Frege, there's 1879 when the Begriffsschrift shows up, 1884 when the Grundlagen is published, and then the 1890s when the important work and the first volume of his two-volume work appears. But the 1890s, 92, 93, that's when on sense and reference, concept and function, concept and object show up. And then 1919, he publishes The Thought. So The Thought is what we get near the end of his life. It's worth noting the relative ages of Frege and Moore and Russell. So notice Moore and Russell are born 1 year apart, roughly a quarter of a century after Frege. So when they're 25, he's 50. So when Russell is sending a letter to Frege, Russell is a young whippersnapper and Frege is a mature scholar. That's part of the story of his initial reaction to Russell's letter. In any case, Russell lives all the way to 1970. Moore died in 1958 and retired from Cambridge in 1939. Wittgenstein, in contrast, was born 16, 17 years later and died before both of them. Died in 1951. The Philosophical Investigations, his later work, wasn't really a book that he wrote, but rather a collection of things put together by Rush Rees and Anscombe, who were both friends of Wittgenstein's and highly influenced by him as well. In any case, so Wittgenstein is a much younger person. So if you imagine Wittgenstein going to college, you should expect him going to college about 4 or 5 years before World War I breaks out. So if he's roughly 20 when he's going off to college or in college, you can see that Russell and Moore will be in their early to mid 30s. So roughly at the level of junior professors in the American system. They're relatively young, but not that distant in age from Wittgenstein. So here's some interesting quotes about the background for Wittgenstein's connection to Russell and Moore. Russell says of Frege's Begriffsschrift, I possessed the book for years before I could make out what it meant. Indeed, I didn't understand it until I had myself independently discovered most of what it contained. That's a revealing quote. Geach, here's what Geach says about Wittgenstein. Peter Geach, by the way, was married to G.E.M. Anscombe, so was quite close with Wittgenstein. He said about Wittgenstein himself stated in conversation that when he was young, he believed Schopenhauer to have been fundamentally right, though, not surprisingly, he could make nothing of the objectification of the will. So, to understand Wittgenstein, it's useful to know something about Schopenhauer. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about Schopenhauer, but it's worth noting that there is a Schopenhauer background. Here's the other side of that coin. This is from Brian McGee, who's a Wittgenstein, especially a later Wittgenstein fan. No one disputes that Wittgenstein was soaked in Schopenhauer. The point is, though, that he was not soaked in anyone else. There was no other philosopher of the past whose work he knew even passably well. So Wittgenstein is not a scholar of philosophy. He's not thoroughly familiar with much of philosophy, but he was a fan of Schopenhauer when he was young. He read a lot of Schopenhauer. Let's attend briefly to the Schopenhauer background then, to understand a little bit about what Wittgenstein was reading. Schopenhauer presents his work as a synthesis of Eastern and Western philosophy, both ancient and modern, about the nature of ultimate reality and how one ought to live. The first step is the typical idealism at the time, the world as representation. Remember, the title of the book is The World as Will and Representation. When I talk about things, I mean things I am or could be aware of. So that's the idealism in Schopenhauer. But representation also signals in Kantian fashion for Schopenhauer a thing in itself. It is an idea of something that is represented. Schopenhauer resists the ultimate unknowability of things in themselves. That's a typical idealist move, claiming that we have to have knowledge, or something really close to it, of the I. So knowledge, self-knowledge, knowledge of yourself as yourself is somehow absolutely required and shows that things in themselves can't be completely unknowable to us. So the I is not part of the phenomenal world of space-time and causality, but part of the true reality, which is eternal. And in some sense, all distinction, this is really messy, mystical, mysterious, I don't know what to make of it, but the idea is, in some sense, all distinction is lost between wills here, so that behind the phenomenal veil, all is one. This is, by the way, a typical aspect. You find this over and over in absolute idealisms of the 19th century. Distinctions disappear. Everything becomes one when you get beyond the veil. How to understand that, make sense of it, is hard to say, but in any case, it's a fairly common theme. For Schopenhauer, it runs through the notion of the self. In any case, because of this metaphysical understanding, egoism is a drastic mistake. Instead, the proper metaphysics leads to altruism, to loving not one's own life, but life itself. And then death is not to be feared because one's focus is on life, not one's own life. The result turns out to be a life of stoical or Buddhist detachment and altruism, and art is immensely important here to Schopenhauer because it has the power to detach us from earthly concerns and somehow present things to us under the aspect of eternity. So the sense to get here is that there's something deeply mystical that shows up by the time you get to the oneness aspect of Schopenhauer. But it is this oneness aspect of Schopenhauer that generates the philosophy of life that's central to the view. this life of detachment and altruism does not arise except in virtue of the monism, the oneness aspect near the end of the metaphysical system. Wittgenstein believed all this from his youth. Though he never understood, he said, how the world as construction of the will was supposed to work. With that, I think it's easy to resonate. How to make sense of that idea of distinctions between wills disappearing once you leave the phenomenal realm. That's a hard thing to understand. In any case, that was Schopenhauer's view. Wittgenstein liked things in Schopenhauer but didn't understand that part. Notice that this leaves a central role for representation in a proper understanding of reality. This notion of representation is going to be absolutely essential, absolutely central to the Tractatus. And the ethical outlook as a central payoff of a proper understanding of the world was always in focus in his thinking. I'm not sure how much you know about the Tractatus, but the Tractatus has as a central element that there's stuff we can say and there's stuff we can't say. There's stuff we can't say that can only be shown, and what can be shown is the important part. So you do get an ethical outlook being central to the Tractatus. The stuff that matters most is stuff that you can't say. You can only show it. There's a famous story about Wittgenstein being invited to the Vienna Circle to talk to them about his views. He showed up, turned his back on the audience, and read poetry to them. Then he left. It's an astonishing performance. What was he doing? What was he thinking about? We don't know. He never said. But it's pretty obvious if you think that the most important things in life, including art and how to live, ethical matters, wisdom, all that sort of thing, are things that you cannot say but can only show. Maybe reading them poetry is part of what's going on here. You're showing or trying to show what's really important, and Schopenhauer's emphasis on the importance of art would be central to that sort of an explanation of what Wittgenstein was up to. In any case, it's a very strange performance, but Wittgenstein was a very strange person in many ways. Note also that Wittgenstein's family called the Tractatus Ludwig's Little Book on Ethics. When you read the Tractatus, that's a hard description to find, but the importance of the distinction between what can be said and what can only be shown helps to see why they might have thought it was a little book on ethics. So here's Wittgenstein, born in 1889, so 16, 17 years younger than Russell and Moore, born into an immensely wealthy family. As I understand it, they were the second or third most wealthy people in all of Austria. They had numerous houses, so if you do a Google search for Wittgenstein's house, you'll find all sorts of different pictures because they had houses all over the place. His father, the wealth was generated from the steel industry, and his father had in mind, this was a father, by the way, who had many things in mind for his children. There are two kinds of fathers. Well, there's lots of kinds of fathers. Those that cheer your autonomy and independence and encourage you to do whatever you choose to seek out. And then there are other more directive fathers. Wittgenstein's father was a quite directive father, so he sent him to Manchester in northern England to study engineering. Wittgenstein went to Manchester. This is in 1909, so he's 20 years old, roughly. Studies engineering and becomes fascinated with mathematics, especially the foundations of mathematics. So you can see from a practical standpoint, from a practical beginning point in engineering, he turns to much more abstract studies almost immediately. He finds the mathematics most interesting, and especially the foundations of mathematics. So if you're from Austria and you're thinking about the foundations of mathematics, you might become aware of Frege, which is exactly what happened. So he goes to visit Frege. He goes to visit Frege. Frege puts him off a bit, maybe because he knows he's already been in England, maybe because Frege is farther along in his career at this point. He's now, early 60s, born in 1848, and so by the time you get to 1908, he's 60, so maybe I'm too far along. Remember, Frege was also depressed about the fact that he didn't know what to do about Russell's paradox, realized his attempt to solve it hadn't worked, and he was still thinking about that. So in any case, what Frege told Wittgenstein is, go to Cambridge, study with Russell. So that's in 1911. Wittgenstein shows up in Cambridge. Russell's first reaction, an unknown German appeared, obstinate and perverse, but I think not stupid. What a first impression to create. This is not the kind of impression you hope to make when you go to a professor's office for the first time to introduce yourself. Coming away, well, it's good if you show up and you manage to get your professors to think you're not stupid. That's a good start. But the other part, holy crap. Obstinate and perverse. Now, I'm not so much wondering about Russell's attitude here as Wittgenstein's self-awareness. So most of us have a level of self-awareness where we're a little better at predicting how we're going to come across to people. This is a kind of self-awareness that Wittgenstein apparently didn't have or didn't care at all about, because he showed up, was thought to be obstinate and perverse, and just prevailed, just kept going. After Russell's first reaction, 1 year later, he says this, I shall certainly encourage him. Perhaps he will do great things. I love him and feel he will solve the problems I am too old to solve. This is an interesting remark. Remember, Russell is born 1873, and now we're talking 1912 when he says this. So Russell is not quite 40 years old, or maybe he's right at 40 years old when he says this. When it comes to the work done by great philosophers, 40 is not amazingly old. But remember, the kind of work that he hopes Wittgenstein can do that he's too old to do is highly formal work in the foundations of mathematics. There's a joke among mathematicians that if you haven't done it by the time you're 30 years old, you're not going to do it. So the older you get, the harder this formal work is to do. I've heard the same thing is true about chess. To find grandmasters who are still winning major tournaments at age 40 is unheard of. You got to do it by the time you're 30, and apparently Carlsen, the reigning world champion, is an anomaly here because they think he might be great into his late 30s. That may say something about human beings and their development. We're finding great athletes in general playing at older ages than we used to. So maybe it's not surprising that intellectual ability as well is surviving at a much older age than it did previously. But in any case, Russell at this point is saying he's too old to solve them. He did say after writing Principia Mathematica that he thought he would never do that kind of work again. It just was too hard, it took too much out of him, and he didn't have it anymore. In any case, he has great hopes for Wittgenstein. So a year later, Wittgenstein has convinced him, first he's turned him into a person, he's become a person that Russell loves, and Russell has great confidence in him as well. So in 1912, he enrolls at Cambridge, and Russell assigned him a tutor for logic. The tutor's name is K.E. Johnson. And Johnson reports that after 1 hour, Wittgenstein was teaching him rather than the other way around. Wittgenstein had emotional and intense relationships and discussions with Moore and Russell, but also with John Maynard Keynes, the noted economist who was also at Cambridge. He often sought the solitude of Norway. 2 years later, Moore traveled to Norway simply in order to take notes from Wittgenstein during the winter about what Wittgenstein was thinking. Now, that's an astonishing fact because Wittgenstein, remember, is born in 1889, and so we're talking about 1914. So he's 25 years old, and Moore is early 40s. So Moore goes to find out what Wittgenstein has been thinking and is thinking about. So remember the chronology here. Principia Mathematica was published in 3 volumes from 1910 to 1913. The date of Russell's set theoretic paradox was 1901, or I think he discovered it in 1901, but didn't send it to Frege until 1903. Frege's Grundgesetzen was published in 2 volumes, the first one appearing in 1893 and volume 2 at the terrible moment in 1903, a month or so after the letter appears from Frege to Russell. I'm sorry, from Russell to Frege, not the other way around. So Frege can't change the book. It's too late. It's already being typeset, so he writes an appendix. Here's the opening remark of the appendix. It's astonishing. Hardly anything more unfortunate can befall a scientific writer than to have one of the foundations of his edifice shaken after the work is finished. This was the position I was placed in by a letter of Mr. Bertrand Russell, just when the printing of this volume was nearing its completion. The paradoxes for Frege's program for logic as the basis of mathematics showed that the program was in jeopardy, and the motivation that led to the Tractatus was to see whether a rescue of Frege's program could be accomplished. The way to think about this is Frege's a logicist. His goal is to reduce all of mathematics to logic. That was also Russell's goal, and it's the motivating force for the Tractatus as well. We will save mathematics by showing it's just a special version of logic. World War I happened, though. So he's at Cambridge in 1912. 2 years later, the war breaks out. He was captured in 1917. Apparently, he didn't have that bad a prison camp experience because he wrote the Tractatus while he was there. He finished the Tractatus in 1918, and it was published 3 years later in 1921. Followed a year later by an English translation by C.K. Ogden, but also with the help of Frank Ramsey. He spends the 1920s in Vienna, first giving away his portion of the family fortune, and also working as a gardener, a teacher, and an architect. He then returns to Cambridge in 1929 after conversations with members of the Vienna Circle. We'll talk more about the Vienna Circle when we turn to the second part of the course. But it's this historical sequence of events that's important for understanding the reaction, the attitude people had toward Wittgenstein. So there's a kind of hero worship of Wittgenstein that certain people in philosophy are subject to. And part of it is he's an enormously admirable individual. Two crucial things to note about him. First, he gives away all of his money. How many rich people do that? That's something that's atypical and widely admired. If you're going to give away your money to help people who have much less than you have, that's a kind of saintly behavior. The second thing is he did something that rich people don't have to do. He joined the Austrian army. If you had money, it was very easy to get out of serving in the army or serving in any of the armed forces. Wittgenstein refused to do that. He insisted on doing what other people in his country had to do, and it resulted in him being captured and being a prisoner of war. I'm sure that his life as a prisoner of war was a special one because he had a special last name. But it doesn't matter. Being captured and being a prisoner of war can't be a good experience no matter how nice you are treated. In any case, that's what happens. So he thought when the Tractatus was finished and then published that he was done, that he had answered all of the questions of philosophy. So he leaves Cambridge and returns to Vienna. And he works as a gardener, a teacher, an architect. He went to England and was granted an advanced degree using the Tractatus as his dissertation. And Moore and Russell were on his committee, but Frank Ramsey was the official advisor for the dissertation. Frank Ramsey was a young guy as well, roughly contemporaneous with Wittgenstein, but he was a star young academic at Cambridge at the time and actually died very young, like 26 or 27. We'll come back to his name later on when we look at reactions to the Tractatus, because he not only directed this dissertation, that's a misleading characterization. He was the official advisor for it. Nobody directed it, as we will see. But Ramsey then wrote a review of it after the translation appeared in 1921 and had the most penetrating, insightful criticisms of the Tractatus that I think have ever appeared. So in any case, that's the sequence that led to the end of the first period, the early Wittgenstein period. And then by the time he comes back to Cambridge in 1929, we're moving toward the later Wittgenstein, which culminates with the publication of the investigations, philosophical investigations after his death in 1951. I used to ask people to read the Tractatus, but it is too hard. It makes no sense without all sorts of, you'd have to spend an entire semester on the Tractatus. And so reading it quickly in a survey course on the history of analytic philosophy, I finally decided is not a useful use of your time. So let's first talk about what we see when we look at the Tractatus. One way of looking at the Tractatus has it asserting an unremitting realism about the world, which is interesting given the idealism of Schopenhauer, the one person that Wittgenstein has read in the history of philosophy. Now, this characterization of the Tractatus in terms of realism is controversial and disputed. Many people doubt that there really is a realism going on here. But let's go with it for the time being. Also central to the Tractatus is the same kind of connection between language, thought, and mind that we noted in Frege and Russell. The connection is found in the nature of logical form. So your job as a philosopher, if you're going to talk about the nature of reality, what you must do is investigate this idea of the logical form of sentences in your language. The domain of what he calls the ethical, but which is more clearly talked about in terms of what is important, and the mystical. So absolutely central to the Tractatus is there's two things that we try to talk about: the stuff that matters and the empirical contingent stuff that science investigates. And the stuff that matters, the ethical, broadly conceived, we simply can't talk about. He then ends the Tractatus with this perplexing passage. My propositions are elucidatory in this way: he who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless. When he has climbed out through them, on them, over them, he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. He must surmount these propositions, then he sees the world rightly. This is perplexing. I mean, it's actually contradictory, because he who understands me. Well, it's not a person we're understanding, but what you're trying to understand is what this person is talking about. And if you can understand what Wittgenstein is talking about, what it is that you're understanding is the propositions he's expressing. But if the proposition he's expressing are literally senseless, what is it that you're understanding? That's what's perplexing about this last remark. This is something that we find quite often in the history of philosophy, where philosophers start from starting points and then they end up with indefensible, sometimes self-contradictory, incoherent endpoints, and somehow think that was a place that they could sit and remain without going back and trying to figure out where they screwed up earlier on. It's an astonishing fact about people. Maybe it's a kind of self-defensiveness, but in any case, it's a mystery how you can do that. You should have seen right away that something went wrong and you needed to go back and start over. So the content, besides the themes of the Tractatus, let's look at some of the content of the Tractatus. Wittgenstein holds that there are three categories into which our sentences fall. There's those that have sense, there are the senseless ones, and then there's nonsense. So senseless and nonsense are not synonymous. The senseless is going to be things like, if you take the latter two categories, which look like they're saying something really negative, there's some stuff that is just totally goofy. That when we get to the logical positivists, they'll pick on certain kinds of German philosophers. Like Heidegger once said, the nothing knots itself. The nothing, and of course you have to capitalize nothing. And then knots is negation turned into a verb. The nothing knots itself. And it's really easy to look at that sentence and see it as noise. Nothing but noise. It has no semantic content at all. It looks a little bit like it would have semantic content because it's got words in English. But as you know, you can string together words in English that make no sense at all. So in any case, there are sentences like that. But in addition to sentences like that, there are also sentences that are structural, like those of mathematics. So Wittgenstein says they don't have sense because the realm of sense is the land of contingency. So among the things that he says more negative things about are both logical truths and stuff that literally makes no sense at all. Clarity on the above, Wittgenstein holds, reveals what philosophy is for, to make clear the difference between what can be said with sense, the contingent and empirical, and what can only be shown, what's important. So that's the ethical component. The stuff that truly matters cannot be said with sense, but can only be shown. So it turns out the statements of ethics are not among the statements of language that have a sense. Only the contingent and empirical has that. The book is thus a book about drawing boundaries for thought, how it functions in the domain in which it can function at all, how thought can function in the domain in which it can function at all, and the limits on that domain. The continued work of the philosopher is to take the work of dogmatic theory-building philosophy and point out how it has reached beyond the limits of thought. This is a theme that the logical positivists are going to pick up on as well. On matters of sense, we get a version of logical atomism. Russell is famous for his own version of logical atomism, but everything is built out of logical atoms. For Russell, the logical atoms were sense data. For Wittgenstein, he never tells you what the logical atoms are. How you build every other truth out of these logical atoms is through the device, which shows up for the first time in history, the device of truth tables for constructing the truth values of complex expressions in terms of truth values of the atoms. So if you remember, let's see if I can get a clean page. I will. Here's a clean page. If you remember from your first logic class, or if you didn't take one, we start out with atomic sentences. Let's not do it in predicate logic, but just in propositional. So you've got propositions like P, Q, R, S, whatever. And then you have complex sentences constructed from each of these atomic elements. So you can have arrow formulas, you can have double arrow formulas, you can have wedge formulas, and you can have ampersand formulas. And our definition of a well-formed formula tells us that if both P and Q are well-formed formulas, then so is P arrow Q. And now the question is, how are we supposed to understand the P arrow Q formula? Suppose you have a grasp of the logical atoms, and suppose P and Q are the logical atoms. So you know the conditions under which they're true, and you know the conditions under which they're false. So you know that there's 4 combinations of truth values for P and Q. Wittgenstein's idea here is we can construct the truth or falsity of every complex expression from our understanding of the atoms. So if you have a truth theoretic understanding of the atoms so that you know the conditions under which they would be true or would be false, then you can construct in your mind an understanding of the arrow formula. It's just the standard truth table that you learned in standard first-order logic. So if both of them are true, it's true. The distinctive case where it comes out false is where the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. And it's true in the other cases as well. And you can do this for each of the connectives. The wedge symbol stands for or in ordinary English. And so you can build the truth table for this connective as well. It comes out true when either one of the atomic elements in the sentence is true, and false in only one case. So how does the meaning of or differ from the meaning of if-then? Answer: the if-then sentence is false in only one case, and that's the second line of the truth table, and the falsity of the wedge formula occurs in only one case, and it's the fourth line of the truth table. So they have different meanings. That's Wittgenstein's idea of how we construct the world out of the atoms. In addition to this, there are aspects of the view that are worth noting as well. Now, I'm going to advert to some of the details of the Tractatus, even though you haven't read it. But let's open a document that talks about the Tractatus in particular, so that we can take a look at these details. So here's a document on Wittgenstein's views, early and late. We'll get to the later part once we get past this part of the history. So remember, as I noted already, Wittgenstein goes back to Cambridge in 1929, and the first account in writing that we have of what he's thinking about at the time is contained in a paper from 1929 called Some Remarks on Logical Form. But let's look at the Tractatus a little bit. And on this document, if you open it, there's a really interesting hypertext version of the Tractatus, which is fascinating to look at. The Tractatus is it's written in the strangest way. because it's in outline form. So it's got 7 major propositions, and you could have as many as you want. And then it's outlined, but not in sequential order in terms of this. So there is point 1. Point 1, by the way, is the world is all that is the case. That's the first remark of the Tractatus. The world is all that is the case. And then you'll have 1.1 and 1.11 and 1 point. You can see how to do this, how to embed your outline in this way sequentially. And a hypertext version allows you to see the diagrammatic character of the way this works with some control over how you present it on the screen to yourself. So it's interesting to look at, but in any case, here's the heart of the Tractatus. So the Tractatus starts out attempting to get us to understand a notion of necessity. And the notion of necessity is logical necessity. That's what necessity involves. Neither Frege nor Russell talked about this. Remember, Russell is suspicious of the notion of necessity and doesn't want to talk about it at all. There's some interesting details about the link between Russell and Wittgenstein. So Russell is suspicious of language of necessity and doesn't characterize logic in terms of necessity, whereas Wittgenstein wants the Tractatus to explain this notion of logical necessity. The explanation will be in terms of the notion of a tautology, and that's the way in which the notion of necessity and the account given of it connects to truth tables. Because a tautology is one for which, if you've got a truth table of it, the formula, no matter what you assign to the atoms, the formula as a whole comes out true. So Frege and Russell were not going to talk about or were suspicious of the notion of necessity, but Wittgenstein's going to explain it. Russell, on the other hand, was completely comfortable with the notion of identity. And part of the weirdness of the Tractatus is it tries to develop a logical system that doesn't use a notion of identity at all. It's just not there. Wittgenstein was very suspicious of the notion of identity and said we shouldn't be relying on it. It's not a logical symbol or constant. It shouldn't have anything to do with the logic we develop. So in any case, the Tractatus wants to explain necessity in terms of logical necessity. And to get this result, all atomic propositions have to be logically independent of each other and exhaustive of logical space. The second thing to note is the centrality of the picture theory of meaning in the Tractatus. At the fundamental level of atomic propositions or facts, the meaning of everything is fundamentally representational. That's because an atomic sentence is a picture of a fact. It pictures a fact. And pictures are obviously representational. So the picture theory of meaning is absolutely essential and central to the Tractatus. Nothing can have meaning except in virtue of having a logical form constructed out of atomic propositions. So the ether has mass has to be analyzed into parts which picture, the parts here are the atomic propositions, which picture or negate some region of reality. So from this, we get a combinatorial view of necessity and impossibility. From the contingent atoms arises all of modality. Everything that's necessary is necessary in virtue of being constructed by logical connectives from the atoms, and the atoms are all contingent. This may look circular as an account of necessity because, of course, contingency is defined in terms of necessity, negation, and truth, but maybe it's not circular. Maybe it's a fundamental metaphysical claim. There's simply no necessity at the fundamental level, and everything at the fundamental level is like a Humean mosaic. Just one damn thing after another with no connections between them. So there you just say, where does necessity show up in our picture, in our understanding of the world? Answer: only at non-fundamental levels. At the fundamental level, there is no necessity to be found at all. Is that circular? I don't know, but maybe not. Anyway, after reading Air, which we'll turn to in a couple of weeks, you can appreciate what the Vienna Circle saw that attracted them to the Tractatus. Ayer wanted to say, science is good, mathematics is fine, even though nothing mathematical is ever confirmed or refuted by experience because it's a non-empirical discipline. Apart from what can be refuted, confirmed, or verified by experience, there is nothing else that makes any sense at all. So math and science are fine, nothing else makes any sense at all. Everything else is completely meaningless. That's Ayer's view. And you can see that that's something like the Tractatus view, that there are three categories of things. There's this stuff of sense, the senseless stuff, and the nonsense. And for Ayer, just as much as for Wittgenstein, all the important stuff turns out to be meaningless because ethical statements have no objective truth value either. And statements of politics fall into that same category of things. What's important to note in reading here is the Tractatus has all of these appeals to atomic facts. And once you've read Russell's version of logical atomism says, yes, everything depends on the logical atoms, and then he tells you precisely what those logical atoms are. They are sense data. Wittgenstein never tells you what a logical atom is. He says that's a matter for science to tell us about. That's all he'll ever say about it. By the time you get to later Wittgenstein, he reports that he had a derisive attitude toward the particulars. This is maybe part of what he was thinking about. He never felt any obligation to tell you what the logical atoms are. He just thought there had to be such things, and out of them, everything else is built. What of the logic? The logic is unrelentingly extensionalist, as is Russell's and Frege's. So remember, what's the difference between an extensional and an intentional logic? A logic is extensional when you can construct the truth values of complex expressions on the basis of knowing the truth values of the atoms. So if you can give me a truth table for a connective, whoops, that's a little ugly. Not sure what that connective is supposed to be. What I meant to write was the wedge, which is our symbol for or. So if or is a truth functional extensional connective, we can characterize the truth value of the complex expression by characterizing the truth values of the parts. In other words, construct a truth table for it. And that's what the truth table for the wedge looks like in standard first-order theory. You can calculate the truth value of the complex expression from the truth values of the parts. That means this is an extensional constant, an extensional connective. There are other things, other formal systems that have complex expressions that look like they're not going to be extensional. So suppose, for example, let me just use N for it is necessary that P. Let's use B for S believes that P. Now, what are the atoms of these two expressions? The only logical atoms are going to be the sentence names here, P. So P is an atom, and it's the only logical atom because it's the only well-formed formula in here. N is an operator. It operates on a well-formed formula, generating another well-formed formula. Same thing for the belief operator. So this isn't an atom, it's an operator. It's not a complete thought all on its own. it is necessary that, just take those 4 words, it is necessary that, those 4 words put together do not express a thought. So the only atomic propositions we've got, the only atomic facts to appeal to in those 2 sentences are P itself, is P itself. So assign a truth value to P. It's either true or it's false. Can you calculate the truth value of it is necessary that P, given this? Can you calculate the truth value of whether a person believes it, just given its truth value? Well, in the first case, if P is false, you can calculate that P isn't necessary, because there's no better guide to truth than necessary truth. If something's necessarily true, it has to be true. But suppose P is true. Can you calculate whether it's necessary or not? The answer is no. It might be necessary, it might not be necessary. So this kind of a formula is not subject to extensional characterization. It is instead a formula within an intentional logic. Same thing for any logic that includes belief operators. From the fact that something is false, you don't know whether a given person believes it or not. And the same thing for truth. So that's the central difference between extensional and intentional logics. Can you calculate the truth value of a complex expression just from knowing the truth values of the parts? And the Tractatus is unrelentingly extensionalist, as is both the work of Frege and Russell. The central thing that Wittgenstein does is he assumes something that Russell didn't do. Remember, Russell's Principia Mathematica took the wedge and negation as the 2 fundamental logical constants by which you define all the others. Arrow, double arrow, ampersand. And then if you had any others that you wanted to include, you could define those as well. But Russell's got 2. Scheffer in 1913 showed that you can get by with just one connective. It came to be called the Scheffer stroke. That's it. And we now represent 2 different versions. There's an up arrow version and a down arrow. The former is the NAND operator. The latter is the NOR operator for not and not or. So you can see what's going on. The NOR operator contains both not and or. The NAND operator contains both not and. So whereas Russell had to use 2 symbols, if you use one version of the Scheffer stroke, you can get by with that. Now, Wittgenstein assumes that you read this paper. Well, that's a crazy assumption. But Wittgenstein didn't care. He wrote in the preface of the Tractatus that he isn't writing this to help you understand anything. He's just writing it for the 2 or 3 people who've already thought through all of this stuff first. So the latter, the not or, the nor operator, is also known as the Peirce arrow. This is Charles Sanders Peirce, who called it the amphek, from the Greek amphekes, or however you're supposed to say that word, cutting both ways. This, I don't even know what symbol to call this, but that was Peirce's preferred symbol. Quine uses a quine dagger to represent this. And the truth tables for these connectives are these. So NAND comes out false in only one case. Unsurprisingly, because not and by De Morgan's rule is the same as the falsity of the first or the falsity of the second. So or sentences are permissive in terms of coming out true. So NAND will also similarly be permissive. 3 out of the 4 cases, it'll come out true. It'll only come out false when both P and Q are true. And nor is similarly restrictive, because not or is the first one's false and the second one's false. So nor comes out true only when they're both false, and false in every other case. Wittgenstein just assumes the Scheffer stroke idea, so that's all you need, and he presents what he has to say, just talking about the Sheffer stroke and not explaining it. He doesn't even call it the Sheffer stroke. So you have to know something about that in order to see what he's up to. So Wittgenstein uses the latter, the downward arrow or the Sheffer stroke, and presumes knowledge of Sheffer's results. So he avoids the complexity of Russell's approach of needing both a negation and a wedge for primitive symbols. Wittgenstein also insists that the entire logical space of propositions is generated from the atomic ones, and thus that the resulting space is purely extensional. This goes for everything, even for intentional contexts such as S believes P. So remember, that was my example of the logical form of a belief attribution. You have an operator, capital B, and then you identify the individual whose belief it is, and there is a propositional content for that belief. That would be a very straightforward way of representing the logical structure of belief, but unfortunately, that's not going to be extensional. So Wittgenstein is not going to be happy with that. And here's what he has to say to try to get you convinced that belief contexts aren't going to cause a problem for his extensionalism. He says, but it is clear that A believes that P, A thinks P, A says P, are of the form P says P. P in single quotes. The sentence P says P. And here we have no co-coordination of a fact and an object, but a co-coordination of facts by means of a co-coordination of their objects. Now, if you find that very hard to understand, I'm with you. I don't know what he's doing here. But if you look at this kind of sentence, this is a claim that says here could be what we would report in terms of the semantic notion of meaning. What does the sentence P mean? And the disquotational theory of meaning tells us there is nothing to meaning except disquoting. P means P. So if somehow we could represent each of these things, forget the A says P, unless the saying here is asserting, right? If I assert P, he says these all have to have the form that is a metalinguistic construction. And there's nothing here that's going to violate my extensionality. Now that, if it's going to work, takes an awful lot of work to show how it's going to work. I mean, when somebody says, when philosophers say it is clear that, there's a joke that what they mean is, gosh, I'm hoping you're not going to worry about this step because I don't have anything to say about it beyond just writing it down. So I don't know how A believes that P is supposed to be represented metalinguistically. I just don't know that. I don't know how to talk about that. I don't know how to say anything instructive about it. So Wittgenstein recognizes that there's a challenge to his extensionality requirement and tries to say, you don't need to worry about this. The next thing is, here's what Wittgenstein says is the general form of a proposition. So you get P with a line over it. What is that? Capital epsilon with a line over it. Capital N governing epsilon with a line over it. And if you've been doing standard first order logic, you're used to formulas like this. You say, well, that's a proposition. It has a general form. How are we going to characterize the general form of any proposition of any sort? I don't know how to say that for standard first order logic. So it leads you to wonder, what does Wittgenstein take himself to be doing? Well, what he's trying to do is tell you how to generate any particular proposition from some general account of the stuff that there is. So the P part is the set of atomic propositions. This is a set of propositions. N is our symbol for negation of every member. So you take a set of propositions and you have some concatenation principle at work that can generate a set of propositions from these and the negations of them, and now you've exhausted everything that can be said by that construction. So the whole symbol means something like this. Whatever can be obtained by taking a subset of atomic propositions, negating them, then taking any selection of this new set and any of the original set. This process can be repeated indefinitely. Doing so gives you all the possible recombinations of atomic sentences and their negations. And every other proposition, remember, is supposed to be a truth-functional construction of these. General propositions out of conjunctions and disjunctions, and modal propositions out of the contradictions and tautologies. So the idea is we get by this process a combination of sense and the senseless. Remember, the senseless is the stuff of logic and math. It's not nonsense, it just doesn't have a sense. With all else being nonsense, which includes, by the way, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, as well as the truth in solipsism, since the very notion of a subject is not that of something in the world, but at its limits. That's throwing a bone to Schopenhauer here when he talks about the I and the truth in solipsism. So you can see the idea here is, I'm going to tell you how to construct the entire space of propositions using this funky notation. You build the entire space of propositions out of the atomics, subsets of the atomics, and negations of subsets of the atomics. From that, you can construct all the sentences. And those sentences will include those that have a sense, the kind of thing that we investigate in science. Will also include all the tautologies and contradictions, namely the senseless ones. And then everything else is nonsense. The stuff that can't be said and makes no sense, has no significance at all. The senseless doesn't say anything because it doesn't picture anything. Only the things with sense picture things. So if you remember that quote that I focused on late in Russell, where he talked about the nature of logic, he was complaining about Meinong. And he said, look, logic says stuff about the real world just as much as zoology does. It's just more abstract and as general as anything can be. Wittgenstein challenges Russell on this point and says that's not the right way to think about logic. Logic does not say anything about the world. It's not like zoology. It's not like physics, chemistry, or any of the sciences. It simply doesn't say anything about the world. What it does is present us with the logical space in which you can say things about the world that are either true or false. As such, it's not characterizing the world because it doesn't picture anything. It is rather senseless. So on this score, contemporary logicians sort of agree with Wittgenstein. Logic doesn't characterize the world. It characterizes the structure in which reality can subsist or exist. So the reality in question, the contingencies that make up the actual world, are to be found in logical space. But logical space, characterizing logical space in terms of the logical truths, is not to characterize reality. It is to characterize the space in which what is real can be found. It's an infinitely dense logical space, and we happen to be in just one little point in this infinitely dense logical space, but there's lots of other such points, all of which fall within the same space of logical truths. So Wittgenstein's distinction between what has sense and what is senseless, if you divorce yourself from the negativity of calling the logical truths senseless, he has a much more contemporary understanding of logic than Russell did. Notice that's part and parcel with him being less averse to the language of necessity and possibility than Russell was. Russell wanted to avoid appeal to those kinds of notions. Wittgenstein says we don't need to be averse to these, we just need to characterize them in terms of tautologies and contradictions. There is, by the way, instead of reading the Tractatus, there's a more pedagogically sensitive source for Wittgenstein's ideas coming from Wittgenstein himself. When he went back to Cambridge, he lectured at Cambridge on the central ideas of the Tractatus to Cambridge students, and he was much more forthcoming in those lectures. I still think Wittgenstein is not the best person to listen to when trying to understand what the Tractatus is about, but at least the Cambridge lectures are better than the Tractatus. The Tractatus is, I would say, fundamentally intractable in terms of your ability to understand it. Maybe you can understand it after you've already done all of the work to get up to speed with everything he's talking about. In any case, the Tractatus was published in 21 in German and then a year later in English. And one of the first things that happened after this is Ramsay published a review of the book because he thought it was really important. So here are the central historical criticisms of the Tractatus, both coming from Ramsay. Now remember, for Wittgenstein, truth tables tell us everything there is to know about necessity, contingency, possibility, and impossibility. That's absolutely essential to his understanding of these notions. And Ramsay was suspicious. So it sounds like this is a very esoteric problem, but it's actually a pretty deep one. So Ramsay has a color problem for the Tractatus. So take the sentence, nothing can be red and green all over. So let's just put that, let's simplify our representation. It's not the case that something X is red and green. And I'm going to skip the all over part. Nothing is both red and green. That's impossible. Well, it's necessary because being both red and green all over is impossible. So we get something in the domain of necessity going on with this kind of a sentence. And you're supposed to be able to explain the necessity or impossibility of any sentence that is necessary or impossible in terms of truth tables. Now, for that to work, you'd have to do something so that one of these involved the negation of the other. So if you could say, let's take the claim that a given object is red and not blue and not yellow and right. And so what you're doing here is you're trying to tell me what this concept of greenness is. And instead of saying, well, it's the concept of being green, you have to construct it out of negations of other color terms, because what you need is a list, a big long conjunction that includes not R on it. So can you define the color green in terms of the negations of all the other color terms? That's a daunting task. I mean, really, is that your understanding of the concept of being green? You certainly didn't learn it that way by constructing it out of negations of a whole bunch of other properties. And besides that, if you think about how color terms work, you've got lots of them. Are there somehow 7 or 8 basic colors that are exhaustive? There's perhaps a scientific theory about color that can break it down in that way, where you give labels to light wave patterns or something like that, but that's not how ordinary language works. So that's the first thing that Ramsay said. Explain to me the necessity of nothing can be red and green all over by relying on the techniques of truth tables alone. That, Ramsay thought, wasn't going to be able to be done. That what we have here is just a bunch of incompatible properties, being red all over, being green all over, but where you don't represent either one of those in terms of the negation of the other, but you just have this understanding that there's a fundamental incompatibility between the two concepts, and that generates a notion of necessity and impossibility that can't be characterized in terms of logical necessity involving negations, one being the negation of another. That's a very deep problem. What it points to is the general idea that there are kinds of necessities that are not to be identified with logical necessity. Wittgenstein thought otherwise and thought there wasn't any interesting notion of necessity other than logical necessity. I don't know what he would have said or thought about this. He didn't actually respond to Ramsey ever. But it might incline you to go back with Russell's view and say, look, if there are other notions of necessity that can't be characterized in terms of logical necessity, maybe we just need to get rid of the notion of necessity from our theorizing completely. We'll come back to that when we talk about the Vienna Circle. The second major worry in Ramsey's review had to do with the ontology of the Tractatus. So remember, the first sentence of the Tractatus is this one: the world is all that is the case. That's a pregnant remark because what he's trying to do is point out that the alternative view is not where you should start. The alternative view would say, no, all of reality is the collection of objects that there are. The world is just a big collection of things. Wittgenstein disagrees with that. He says the world is all that is the case. So what are you going to say, Wittgenstein, about objects? Because they have a substantiality to them that is independent of what is the case. So you have to say something about objects. What are you going to say? So you start with the fundamental principle, the world is all that is the case. Tell me about objects. Well, Wittgenstein agrees. Objects subsist independently of what is the case. So just take an object. Suppose there's a tree outside your window. It subsists independently of what is the case. I'm looking at a tree outside my window. It has no leaves on it. So what is the case is that this object has no leaves on it now. But the object is somehow independent of it existing lacking leaves, because it doesn't have to exist lacking leaves. So in some sense, objects subsist independently of what is the case. For Wittgenstein, objects are the basic building blocks of the world. They are the substance of the world. Notice there's a definite description here, and if you think with Russell, objects are the substance of the world, then there's a uniqueness requirement on that as well going on here. And Wittgenstein further says all of logical space have the same substance. That last remark is perplexing. All possible worlds have the same substance. The objects are the building blocks of the world. They are the substance of the world. And all of logical space has the same substance. Now, why would he have to say this last thing, all possible worlds have the same substance? Well, remember, all of necessity, all of logical space is characterized by the concatenation we find of atomic propositions. And atomic propositions, those are the contingent things that talk about states of affairs in the world. And so the only things that we ever talk about at the atomic level are going to be objects that are the basic building blocks of the world. And all of logical space is characterized in terms of those building blocks. So, all possible worlds have the same substance. Here's some quotes. It is clear that however different from the real one an imagined world may be, it must have something, a form in common with the real world. That's the reference to logical space. No matter how different any two worlds are, they still occupy the same logical space. What is this logical space? This fixed form consists of the objects. Substance is what exists independently of what is the case. Wittgenstein also says that the number of objects can't be determined a priori. It's a matter of physics to find that out. So he's just not going to talk about what these basic building blocks are. But Wittgenstein does assume the existence of at least one object. So this is like what we find in modern presentations of semantic theory. A model is an ordered pair consisting of a domain of objects which can't be empty, together with an assignment of subsets or relations on the domain of objects for each of the predicate letters. But the domain can't be empty. The obvious reason for this is you don't have a point in logical space where nothing exists. If nothing exists at all, you don't even have that point. So Wittgenstein assumes there has to be at least one object. So Wittgenstein holds that the class of objects includes things as well as properties and relations, and that the ontology is fixed because every point in logical space has to have the same form as the actual point in logical space. This is important because without it, you can't give a combinatorial theory of necessity, one built up out of contingent and independent logical atoms. When you concatenate these independent logical atoms, you're still talking about nothing more than whatever those atoms talk about. So take my metaphorical language of logical as opposed to physical space, with each point occupied by the atoms. At each point, you have an on-off switch, and then the combinatorials on the space tell you when you have a tautology or a contradiction, and that's all there is to necessity. With one exception, and this is Ramsey's point. The exception is, how are you going to explain the necessity of the ontology? It looks like it's going to escape this combinatorial net that you were trying to weave. In any case, those are Ramsey's two fundamental worries about the ontology. Wittgenstein did not respond to the review. He had already gone back to Vienna thinking he was done. He had solved all the problems of philosophy. He had nothing else to talk about. Various things happened in Austria, and he ended up returning to Cambridge in 1929. We don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he was reflecting, maybe part of it was he was reflecting on Ramsey's criticisms and deciding there was more work to be done. I don't know if that's the most important thing. We'll talk about this later, but Wittgenstein assaulted one of his second grade students for not being very good at mathematics. It was a handicapped child, and he hit him and knocked him down or knocked him out or something, which tends to make people relatively unhappy with the teachers of their elementary school students. Because it was a rich family, the charges against him were ultimately dropped, so he didn't end up being tried for assault on a child, but he did lose his job. Maybe that's why he went back to Cambridge. In any case, we'll talk about that later. So we will return to our discussions of Wittgenstein and the role of the Tractatus, but we will begin the second part of the course by talking more about the Vienna Circle and the relationship between the Tractatus and the Vienna Circle and the war effort and public policy, social reform issues facing Austria and the post-World War scene in most of Europe, well, all of Europe. In any case, that's the end of our first part of the course, the end of our discussion of Wittgenstein.